morning, and welcome to our webinar on the role and value of nature for climate risk management. I'm Audrie, Director of Research at GRI, and I will be your host. Although this event is virtual, and you may be joining us from other parts of Canada and beyond, I want to take this moment to acknowledge that the Global Risk Institute is situated in Toronto on the traditional territory of many nations, is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Through this land acknowledgement, we want to bring context to the history of our country and the importance of working toward reconciliation in all the ways we can. Now, a few housekeeping details before we get started. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared on our website. We've set aside ample time for questions during the Q&A period that follows our speaker discussion, so please submit your questions through the chat and we will address as many as time allows. Finally, when you exit the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete an event survey. Please take a moment to do so and let us know your thoughts on this event. We use your feedback to ensure we continue to deliver the high-quality programming you expect, so thank you in advance. And on that note, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers. Joanna Eyquem is Managing Director of Climate Resilient Infrastructure at the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation. Joanna is an internationally recognized leader with 25 years experience in climate adaptation and nature-based solutions. Joanna leads the development of national guidance on climate resilience and nature-based solutions, including disclosures of natural assets and the ecosystem services they provide in financial statements and sustainability reporting. Lorraine Audsley is president of the Bosco Corporation and was previously CRO and Chief Sustainability Officer at Export Development Canada. There, as member of EDC's executive leadership team, Lorraine managed the organization's financial operations and strategic risk maturity and risk culture, while concurrently driving forward EDC's environmental, social, and governance strategy, policy, research, disclosure, and reporting. Gildas Poissonnier is Chief Sustainability Officer at Desjardins Group, where his team supports the integration of ESG criteria into decision-making and operations, and the development of responsible finance products in line with Desjardins' climate change commitments. He is co-chair of the Green and Transition Finance Council of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and a member of the Advisory Committee of the Government of Quebec's Sustainable Finance Roadmap. Finally, we have Bertrand Millot, who is head of sustainability at CDPQ, where he leads the stewardship investing team responsible for integrating ESG factors into all activities and deploying the climate strategy. One of the architects of the climate strategy, he is also a seasoned investor in infrastructure and corporate debt in emerging markets, having held various positions in risk management and stewardship investing. Now, before getting into the discussion, I'll kick things off with some very basic nomenclature and concepts. The first thing to be aware of is that the word asset means something different to everyone. For example, accounting professionals use the terminology nature resource asset, and they use this term strictly in circumstances where a nature-related item can be measured and valued from an accounting perspective. I'll leave it to Joanna to elaborate further on current nature-related accounting trends as we move through the discussion. A natural asset, generally speaking, is the use of preserved, restored, or enhanced elements of nature, including land, water, and naturally occurring ecological processes, to meet targeted infrastructure outcomes. Good examples of these include coastal hazard management, riverine flood management, local stormwater management, and mitigation of the effects of extreme heat. Natural assets that deliver infrastructure outcomes are sometimes referred to as natural infrastructure. Now, we have ecosystem goods and services. What do these refer to? They refer to the benefits that are realized through economic and other human activity, and they're typically considered in three categories: provisioning services, regulation and maintenance services, and cultural services. So provisioning services are often these goods have a market value and are traded, such as timber, fish, paper, cocoa. Regulation and maintenance services, just as it sounds, these are services that regulate ecosystem processes. Examples include air quality, water purification, pollination, and carbon sequestration. Now, cultural services are services such as spiritual, recreational, and cultural benefits that people obtain from nature. Examples include physical and mental health benefits, recreation, and tourism. Now, how did we arrive here from the conversation on climate? Essentially, we cannot address climate change without considering nature, and I will ask our esteemed panelists to explain exactly why this is the case from different vantage points. Why is nature important for financial institutions? Well, from commodity trading volumes to nature-related shareholder resolutions to asset degradation or appreciation stemming from nature-related risks and opportunities, you can see there are numerous nature-related implications, which we will touch on throughout this webinar. Now, moving to the next slide, this slide is an adaptation from the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, and courtesy of Joanna and the team at Intech Center and Partners. This image and detailed commentary is included in their upcoming report titled Getting Nature into Financial Reporting, Natural Asset Disclosures for Local Government, which will be released in the coming weeks. Stepping back for a moment, TNFD's main focus is on risk and opportunities. However, to get to something meaningful for your organization, you actually need to do the work to understand the interdependencies on ecosystem services, after which you can begin to understand and identify the risks and opportunities. I'll let Joanna elaborate further on the elements of this diagram as we get into the discussion. Now, without further ado, let's dive right in. Lorraine, I'd like to kick it off with you and tell us, why should our audience care about this topic? What are the statistics and compelling arguments for why this topic is important, relevant, and timely for financial institutions?
Thank you, Audrey. Welcome, everyone. I'll start by saying that there is no net zero without nature. Many companies have made their net zero commitments, and we're all working towards that. So there is no net zero without nature. Natural ecosystems are a critical element in the climate solution. Ecosystems clean our water, they protect us from floods, sequester carbon, pollinate our crops, as Audrey has explained as well. And in recent years, a singular focus within ESG has been on climate, which has obscured our dependence on nature and its importance in the climate mitigation adaptation story. So the good news is that there's changing focus, in that there's more focus now being put on the risks and opportunities of nature positive solutions. And I think there's an understanding that threats to nature threaten our economy. And so we know that half of global GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature, and that's to the tune of $44 trillion. There's also in recent years, a World Bank report that estimated that the collapse of certain ecosystems, like food from marine fisheries or timber from native forests, or even pollination of our crops, could result in a decline of global GDP of $2.7 trillion annually by 2030. So these are very large and compelling numbers. So there is, I'll say boldly, there is no economy without nature's critical services, including clean and abundant water, clean air, and food. So then, if we think about it from a business perspective, the resilience of businesses and organizations and financial institutions does rely on nature. The present and future cash flows of businesses depend on the future flow of nature's inputs into their business models to create their products to sell to customers. So a few examples of that. Soil nutrients and pollination of crops is essential for the agri-food business. So relating to, and food insecurity is one of the great issues of our time. So very important. Supply of high quality water is essential for everything from the manufacturing of semiconductor chips all the way through to the beverage industry. And then natural compounds are used greatly by pharmaceutical companies. So just three examples of industries that have great reliance on natural assets. So therefore, nature loss is a strategic risk, and for companies and for financial institutions. And it's increasingly being seen as a material risk, which needs to be disclosed. There's much more attention being put on nature by investors, insurers and lenders related to disclosure, demanding better disclosure so that they can make more informed decisions. So we know that nature is important, and yet statistics show continued high biodiversity loss and environmental degradation. We also know there's a large funding gap, more than $700 billion, multiples of which is still going to projects that degrade nature. And that we also know we've breached 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, which are the safe operating conditions for humanity. So I would say that we need to reimagine the value of nature. So we use nature because it's free, seemingly, and we lose nature because it doesn't have a price. And so nature does have a value beyond that which the market gives it today. So I would say that, again, that we as business leaders need to reimagine the value of nature and make sure that that value is actually put on it. There's a report recently from the World Economic Forum on the new nature economy, and it concludes that $10.1 trillion worth of business opportunities exist by 2030 in the nature positive market. So we also know that nature-based infrastructure can cost up to 50% less than traditional infrastructure. So things like oceans and forests are great carbon sinks as compared to, say, carbon capture and storage capital-intensive projects. And then maybe I'll say that the tools and data to get started do exist today, and I believe that there'll be a great ramp up in those tools and data over the next 12 to 24 months or so. So maybe I'll just end by saying that we need increased awareness of nature risks and opportunities. And so thank you everyone for being here today, because this is part of that. We need more capital to flow into it. We need innovative financial models to help support that capital flow. And regulation and policy, of course, is always supportive. So then, based on everything I've said, I hope you agree that executive committees and boards should be talking about nature risks and opportunities to their business models. So Audrey, I'll pass it back to you.
Great, thank you, Lorraine. And I'm really glad you touched on valuations, the value of nature. Obviously, that's why we're all a big part of why we're here today, and also GDP, which we'll get into a little bit in more depth later on. But for now, Joanna, I'd like to hand things over to you. Please give us the researcher perspective on nature and how the recognition of capital stocks potentially leads to investment opportunities. Oh, just take yourself off mute.
It was going to be one of us. It was going to be me.
Yeah.
Yeah, at the Intech Center, we're doing a lot of work on the role of natural assets and nature-based solutions that involve natural assets on reducing climate risk, like flooding and extreme heat, for example. It is research, but it's also generating best practices and actually helping provide tools on the ground. So it's kind of, I would say it's not just an academic perspective, but really more practical as well. And, you know, assets like wetlands and floodplains and upland forests are really an effective means of reducing downstream flooding, for example, and can cost less to maintain in the long term, as Lorraine alluded to. And I think the fact that these assets are not valued, but they are definitely, you know, they're seen as priceless. Sometimes we're scared of putting a value on it because it's not going to be one that covers the whole value of nature, but they are definitely not worthless. So the Institute for Financial Sustainable Finance actually estimated that Canada's wetlands alone provided services valued at around $225 billion annually, which is not on anyone's balance sheet at the moment. You know, that's a fairly huge emission. And degrading these assets actually increases climate risk in many cases. So for example, for flooding, where we're in a human modified watershed, flooding is actually worse because when we're degrading natural assets, we're kind of speeding up the flow of water and making so that it doesn't like infiltrate into the ground, etc. And actually we get more flooding. So in order to make meaningful disclosures about physical climate risks, we actually really need to be considering nature. So I'm hoping that they will be combined rather than being treated as separate elements at the moment in disclosure standards. And I would say, well, TNFD focuses on risks, accounting very much focuses on value. And I think, the value of nature as infrastructure is definitely being further recognized by the federal government, by local governments, and hopefully now also by financial institutions as infrastructure that delivers important services to support people and that are financially valuable. I've recently been called to serve on the Canadian Infrastructure Council, and we will definitely be looking at natural infrastructure, particularly in water infrastructure services. So this shift in seeing kind of nature as something to protect for nature's good, and rather as infrastructure that has service potential to people, we're kind of shifting the conversation to investment rather than funding. Because often when you see people talking about money being put into natural assets, it's called funding, and it's kind of this seen as a kind of a bit of a bottomless pit, I guess. What are you getting back? Whereas if we actually value these services, it's an investment, and we can see the return on our investment as well. And as we're very keen to engage the private sector in investing in urgent climate adaptation. The figures are in for 2024 at $8.5 billion in insured losses alone. And typically, the total losses are about 3 to 4 times that. So this is a financially material risk, and investing in nature is one of the ways that we can bring those losses down, because at the moment the trend is upwards, and when there's less money available in the public purse, we really do need the private sector to step in as well, because greater climate resilience is good for everybody.
Yes, thank you, Joanna. And I'd like to start to make this more tangible from a different vantage point for a moment. So I'm going to go over to Bertrand right now. In our conversations about the interrelationship between biodiversity, nature, and investments, we talked about French fries, coffee beans, and cocoa, some of my favorite foods, and described the nature and the imminent or longer term issues for these products and commodities and how these relate to financial institutions in terms of investment risk and opportunity.
Thank you, Audrey, and hello, everybody, and thank you for including me. I'll go slightly broader than those first, and then narrow it down if I can. But generally, I mean, the way we see the biodiversity issue is there is a question of conservation, which is something that is very difficult to address for investors because there is no business model associated with that yet. So it's probably today a remit for governments, unless some financial instruments in some way are designed through credits or other ways. There is the question of preventing the wanton destruction of nature, whether it is through deforestation or when you build new infrastructure, etc. And that is something, or mining operations, for example. And that is something that needs to be addressed yesterday. It is very important, and there is very significant risks involved, both reputational, there's business risks. Your products, you might not be able to sell products, for example, in the EU if they come from deforested lands. So you've got an issue. And also, if you ignore these issues and you're intent on building a new plant or a new piece of infrastructure, that project might end up being held up because you haven't done your homework, because you haven't considered alternatives that would be less damaging to the environment, held up by courts, held up by fines, held up by civil society, and therefore potentially a lot of value would be destroyed. So it's very, very important to take this into consideration to make sure that if new things have to be built or mines expanded, and we all know they do, that it is done with due consideration to nature and remediation where possible. The third bit, and this is very interesting from an investor point of view, is the ability that we have to invest in nature positive solutions, whether it is forestry or sustainable agricultures. These domains are developing and therefore present to us, a long-term investor, long-term investment opportunities that are aligned with our business model and align with the future, and so they are somewhat future-proof compared to other opportunities that may not be. And the fourth, and I'm coming back to the coffee and hamburgers, it is the question of the ongoing, what I would call microaggression to nature, which largely reside in the food and fiber industries. Obviously, we consume these products; they're critical to our well-being. But the way these products are produced, sourced, is unsustainable largely, and therefore, obviously, we need to change the way we do business. It is not going to be sustainable over the long term. There's already issues, as you know, with regards to coffee supply chains, which are under stress because of the climate planetary issues. Cocoa, the same. So we as investors have a very important role to push companies to adopt better practices, to reduce risk, to increase their potential marketing ability. Companies that do the right thing should have a competitive edge, and gradually shift from those unsustainable practices to sustainable practices. It has to be gradual because those are very complicated supply chain. They're very, very important, and we need to push. We have a role. We're part of a number of engagement initiatives to push companies to do the right thing.
Yes, and we're going to touch on that momentarily. So thank you, Bertrand, for that context. Now we're going to transition to the barriers. So what are the barriers to investment, to advancing the agenda for nature and biodiversity within your organization? So we're going to conduct an audience poll to get a sense of where you see barriers to managing nature-related risks. So you'll see it pop up on your screen. Please respond to the poll questions that you see there. And while we wait for those results to come in, we're going to turn to Gildas to comment on the progress that Desjardins has made internally and externally with advancing the biodiversity agenda. You've made significant progress, so tell us about it, and how has Desjardins managed to get time to discuss this relatively new issue at the management and board level? What kind of resistance have you faced in the process, and how has it been managed?
Thank you, Audrey, and thank you to the Global Risk Institute for organizing this great panel. So how did we make progress? Well, I think we did three things. First, we helped executives identify the upcoming nature macro trend. Second, we built a business case around nature. And third, we started progressively. We build up on synergies with our climate initiative. So let me expand on those three things. How did we help executive and board members recognize and assess the nature-related macro trend? Well, we didn't do a scientific class, even though, my background is engineering, so I would have loved to do that. But rather, we did emphasize similarities and differences with the climate macro trend that our executives were more familiar with. So, for example, the three similarities we brought to the table, we explained that it's following a similar uptake trajectory within the civil society, within the policy environment, as with climate, but with a few years delay. First, you have the external stakeholder pressure, the environmental NGO pressure, the scientific community raising the alarm, explaining about the mass extinction, for example. Then you see the uptake of voluntary initiatives that are market-driven, where the financial sector also is kicking in, and that's where the TNFD, similar to the TCFD experience, is coming in. And we push a comparison of the trajectory by highlighting that the regulatory environment for climate in the financial sector is changing very rapidly. In Canada, we know B15 with OSFI, for example, and we expect it will soon, or we don't know exactly when, but within a few years' time, it will probably follow the same trajectory. So helping our executive understand that trajectory is key. Another similarities is that nature-related risk, and Bertrand highlighted a few of those, help us understand new risks and new opportunities, which can be very useful for assessing the relevance and the business sense of a specific investment or a loan or another financial activities that we do have at the cooperative. And the last thing, we also highlighted a similarity around the connected topic of climate and nature. As for example, let me put one number, like forest, land, and agriculture GHG emission are roughly 1/5, so 20% of global emission. So it's big, and by its nature of its sheer size, it is really a way to connect climate and nature as a carbon sink, but also as a source of carbon emission. But we also highlighted three differences. Obviously, nature is much more local in terms of understanding dependencies and impacts. So you need to include a more contextual base, like geographic contextual realization to the issue. I would say that scientifically speaking, the models, the measures, the KPIs are still more complex and more difficult to apprehend. And also competencies and skill sets are even less developed than the ones that are on the market for climate on the market. So that trajectory, that trend is important to understand. And second step we did was to build a business case internally. A few elements, we highlighted key activities. So Quebec ecosystem is quite active on the topic. Obviously today we have CDPQ, but Fonds d'Action, a few NGOs also are quite active. The COP15 in Montreal, so highlighting the business environment. We also recognize that it is initially more important for certain business units than for other in Desjardins Group. Obviously, the asset management arm, Desjardins Global Asset Management, had an earlier take on biodiversity with adhering to the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge or Nature Action 100. So it helped identify key business units, key sectors that are more impacted, like we mentioned, agriculture, forestry, or mining as some of them. And last but not least, we pointed out to our members. And our members, when we pull them, and we pull them every year on their expectation regarding to sustainable finance, nature comes number 3 behind human rights and climate. So it is important for our members and hence for us as a cooperative. Last thing we did, we started progressively leveraging synergies with climate. So building on our climate work and highlighting it is a continuity, it is a solution to some of the issue, but also to some of the solutions that we are looking for when trying to achieve our climate targets. And that some capabilities that we're developing for climate, for example, geospatial capabilities, understanding where our assets are located to assess climate risk, physical risk like floods or fire, then can be easily leveraged for understanding biodiversity risk if you add a layer of information of biodiversity on top of those geospatial capabilities. So those 3 key elements. In terms of challenges, I would say maybe there is still a big knowledge gap within traditional financial people and with a level of science that is included in understanding nature. So we need to bring expertise. That's a challenge. Second, there is still a climate fatigue. I mean, a lot of energy is being put in the financial sector today to understand physical and transition risk from climate. A lot of resources are put into understanding and answering to regulatory requirements. So first reaction is to say, okay, like, do we really want to add this and these elements of nature to our long list of things to do on our environment? And last point in terms of challenges and the external context, like political changes, recent political changes obviously lead to an ESG/climate pushback, and nature is not immune to that. So it needs to be put in perspective of those challenges.
Absolutely. And thank you, Gildas. You've provided such a rich context to the opportunities and challenges within your institution. So really thank you for that color. And now we get to hear from the audience. So the polling results are in. I'm going to ask Jill to bring it up on the screen. And here we are. So I'm going to ask Lorraine to circle back to some of the compelling arguments that you made at the outset for nature and nature commanding time and attention within our financial institutions. So what do you make of the polling results here?
Yes, okay, so I'm just absorbing it as we're talking here. So you're getting my stream of consciousness while reading. So I see that lack of data and metrics is the top one at 16%. And then the next one, short-term financial priorities overshadowing long-term nature risk management. I had that latter one as my top one, just because of the nature of the risk environment today, which has really rapidly evolved just since last November. You know, geopolitics, Canada, US politics, Canadian politics, macroeconomic conditions, you know, tariffs, et cetera. So there's an awful lot going on. And I can imagine boards sort of saying, well, where does nature fit into that? I've got other things to think about. So I can understand that. Notwithstanding, I think that nature still needs to be on the agenda, and it doesn't have to be the top thing or a big bang. It can be, I think Gildas said, progressive. So start talking about it and make progressive steps towards it. You know, development sessions at the board talking about nature risks and opportunities, the science in board member language and such, to just keep it live and keep it moving forward, and also keep it moving along the same path as climate. So it's more building on something rather than something completely new. So trying to get the attention of executive and board members from that perspective. The data and metrics is interesting. Absolutely. Data and metrics are difficult because if you're trying to get the perfect data and metrics for your business, there are organizations like United Nations Environmental Program that have data, and others like GRI. Proxy data is good. And so again, going with start small, start with proxy data. In my experience, I ran the scenarios, climate scenarios, and yes, there was proxy data. So the actual results were not precise, but what was helpful from a decision-making perspective was 1 year after the next, seeing a trend. So using the same methodology, similar data, what directional guidance did that scenario analysis provide using the data that we had, understanding the limitations of the data, but the data was not a reason to not move forward. So that was, so a couple of reactions to D and B.
I think that's great, Lorraine. I think we've heard from the audience. I think those are really the key elements that are that are speaking to everyone in terms of the barriers. I'd like to move the conversation now from barriers to strategy. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bertrand to tell us a bit about the 4 quadrants that you use within CDPQ to break down nature-related risks and opportunities. From managing existing investments to evaluating new opportunities, and now keeping in mind some of what we heard from our audience in terms of short-term priorities versus longer-term, nature-related challenges. The viewpoint being one of the barriers, and then data being the other. So, how would you apply the strategy and the 4 quadrants in that context?
Yes, thank you. Data is an issue. However, I would agree that it shouldn't stop people. And I think also the important thing is it needs to be specific enough. There is in finance a tendency to put everything down to simple numbers. But the problem is there is no simple number that will be able to measure biodiversity risk that applies to beef and forest. Those things are completely different. And so you really need to be specific to understand it. And I agree that you need to compare it from 1 year to the next. In that vein, and I think Gildas alluded to it, we, with Fondation, SNAP Quebec, University of Sherbrooke, and other partners, we actually worked on defining biodiversity indicators for Quebec. Which is important because those things need to be local and even Quebec, South Quebec and North Quebec are very different environments, and so that's more for the southern part of Quebec. So that's the type of exercise that needs to be done, and I would encourage collaborative initiatives of that nature, because the subject is very, very complicated. It is not only specific to each, a cow or a tree or a plant, but to environments. And and this is why, we are part of, and Gildas said the same thing, we're part of a number of collaborative initiatives, because none of us are sufficiently sophisticated on these subjects to be able to handle it. But with the help of others, with the help of science in universities, etc., we're managing to get a grip on it. And I think also the fact that data is not sufficient today, generally, doesn't mean one does nothing. You just have to, and I think it was alluded to, you start and start acting on the basis of the data you have. And the examples that I used earlier, if you're building a new piece of infrastructure, there is plenty of data. Go and find it as to what the environmental impacts might be. If you're involved in activities that deforest the Amazon, there is plenty of data. And so that is highly doable and needs to be acted on immediately. So small steps policy, but the fuzziness, the complexity shouldn't stop people from acting on it.
Yes, certainly. And I love that you highlighted collaboration and the need to draw on expertise from various industries to get to those outcomes. Gildas, I'm going to turn back to you. How does Desjardins look at nature similarly or differently from a banking, insurance, and asset management perspective? You don't need to touch on all of them, but I think one that we're really interested in at the moment is when you look at the wildfires in California right now, how could this tragic situation be evaluated from a nature and an insurance perspective?
Yeah, no, thank you, Audrey. We have an insurance side of business, or property and casualty insurance. So obviously, they look at all those catastrophes and nature-related, somehow nature-related perils or events with great attention. So climate resilience of our infrastructure, of our assets, of our homes is obviously key. And the intention is to say, okay, how can we mutualize efforts to build resiliency against those, and understanding that, and I think Joanna alluded to that some nature-related solutions could be A, more effective, and B, less costly to prevent or reduce the level of impacts and risk of those events. So wetlands or marshlands in terms of managing floods impact around specific areas could be an area of investigation. But also then, what do you do as an insurer to make sure that it is put forward? So there are a lot of discussion internally in the insurance side of our business to understand how can we help influence I would say the different government levels decision-making process to make sure that those nature solutions are factored in where it matters. Like where it matters, it is where you grant building permits, where you allow new infrastructure to be developed, what features you include in those. But I would say it's quite a new conversation to us because we are not necessarily used to try or to leverage that influence, and obviously you want to be careful because you're a business, so you have to factor in lobbying consideration. Where does it stop? So I think it's an interesting time where our insurance is really asking itself question on how to play a positive role in including nature in making sure our society are more resilient to some of those events.
Thank you, Gildas. And I think, we touched a little bit on this earlier in terms of economic measures like GDP overlooking the value of nature. And certainly a GDP figure embedded in so many of the models that we use for risk management. And so, Joanna, I'd like to turn to you to please explain, in what ways are measures like GDP or others overlooking the value of nature?
Yeah, so I think, when we talk about the economy, often we're focused on GDP, and, GDP does take into account some value of nature. For example, those provisional services that you mentioned at the beginning, Audrey, like timber and fisheries, things that we trade and are traded have a market price, are contained in GDP. But the other services are not. Basically, at the moment, in accounting terms in Canada, we actually cannot put inherited natural assets that have not been paid for on our balance sheets. So they are not reflected in GDP. But the fact is that nature is finite. It's not an infinite resource that we can just continually exploit ad infinitum. And I think, for me, one of the graphics that really speaks, and I kind of think about when I'm doing my work, is UNEP have looked at produce capital, so GDP, human capital, and natural capital. And basically, since 92, produce capital per person has grown by 92% up until like 2019. Human capital has grown by 38%, and natural capital has declined by 50%. So we are basically converting nature into produce capital and people, but it's not being replaced. So the trend is down, and this is the problem basically. And the issue that we don't value it at the moment is one of the key things that we're trying to kind of tackle at the Intech Center, because making the case for the nature being financially material when we actually don't reflect it in our financial reporting is a problem. So we're trying to tackle that. And I kind of take from the audience the lack of data and metrics, because one thing that we've been doing very much is trying to kind of make it easy for people to see what kind of metrics they could be reporting on in disclosures. While they can't put it in their accounting, we can make disclosures in financial reporting already. And that is not just around financial valuation, it's also around the extent of natural assets. It's around condition, it's around ecosystem services, and importantly, as Lorraine mentioned, the change over time. So our report that's coming out at the end of the month will basically set out like a stepwise sequential path that people can follow for local governments, but it could also be used for businesses. And it takes into account, like, there's existing guidance from the TNFD, the UN, and the Census of the Environment is the federal government's natural capital accounts. So there's examples of how we are moving forward here, and so that we can take into account nature and go beyond GDP, so that and engage with accountants, actuaries, for example, infrastructure asset management, so that basically knowing the value of nature actually changes the decisions that we're making, and it helps us to direct finance to projects and pathways that will improve nature and maintain our natural capital rather than continually degrading it.
Thank you, Joanna. You've touched on so much right there, like such a rich amount of detail and relevance and statistics that our audience can really sink their teeth into. And I'd like to really open it up to questions now from our audience. We will be monitoring the chat, so please do put your questions in the chat, and we will get to as many as we can. The first one that has come up is actually related to what you just discussed, and I think you've sort of answered the question, but I'll put it forward to you and see if you have anything that you want to reinforce that came out of it. So a major challenge that's recognized is, unlike the valuation of businesses, the value for nature, when estimated, is not perceived as credibly by decision makers or businesses. And so you've provided so many examples of standard setters, bodies, reporting agencies, and different ways in which valuations are now being applied or will be applied imminently to infrastructure assets, particularly in the public domain. So how do we give our stakeholders and senior management teams, executive management teams, the confidence in the valuations that, or metrics that are being put forward?
Yeah, I think, consistency and standards are definitely key here because it's not necessarily an exact science in terms of, but many things are not. I mean, market values fluctuate as well, right? So when you're putting a market value on things, it depends on the time that you've made that market value. So I think also we don't want to subject nature to be more rigorous than we do with our kind of market systems. But I think, standards and clear guidance are definitely relevant. I would mention here, so in Canada, we actually already have a natural asset inventory, National Standard of Canada, that was launched in 2023 to identify natural assets, kind of, physical assets like wetlands and grasslands and things like that. Another key thing is that the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board actually has a draft standard out at the moment for comment that I would invite people in the audience to look at and comment on regarding how natural resources can actually be recognized as assets and the service potential, for example, ecosystem services they could provide can actually be recognized in financial statements. So this goes beyond just disclosures in financial reporting, but actually getting the value of natural assets into financial statements. The Canadian Institute of Actuaries also have a position paper because they are highly aware that nature affects kind of financial risk management. So I think that's also key. And then from a public sector perspective, we have over 160 local governments now actually actively working to identify their natural assets. And some of them, for example, the city of Calgary, the city of Mississauga are already putting values and disclosures in their financial reports. And the idea is that we integrate those natural assets into our kind of into our asset management plan. So this is how cities kind of plan or governments plan in advance what they're going to invest in to maintain services to citizens. So that integration is also highly relevant. But I think, yes, standards, clear standards and frameworks. I would also say there's a for kind of businesses, there's a natural capital accounting for organizations British standard that's being converted to an international standard as we speak. So you can also get involved in that process.
That's great. And I think you've killed a few birds with one stone, not knowingly. There's a few questions coming in that I think that really, really provided a rich context to it in terms of valuations and how to capture that on the financial institution's balance sheet, at least making a step forward in that direction. Bertrand, please go ahead.
I would add, notwithstanding the standards, that there is always the question of thinking at it in the sort of backwards negatively, thinking, what if this happens? How much is that going to cost me? And if that project gets not done, what is the opportunity cost? And you don't need accounting standards for that in order to take it on board. And there's plenty of evidence of a number of development projects or initiatives that have been stranded by questions of biodiversity or nature. You think, oh, I'm going to do this and I need water. Water is free. Yeah, what if there is no water? Not an academic question in today's world. And so that's another way to make business decisions. You don't need standards to do that.
Yeah, and I think you're almost, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're almost alluding to a top-down approach versus a bottom-up approach. There are so many ways to tackle the issue, and sometimes just looking at a macro level and the narrative, it can be really helpful in making progress forward to understand what the issues are. Lorraine.
Maybe I could jump to one of the other questions, which was about companies that are doing a good job at this. And I recently read a paper from the World Economic Forum. It was called 6 Strategies That Leading Companies Are Employing to Advance Towards a Nature Positive Economy. So clearly the title caught my attention. And then it went through the 6 strategies, and it talked about, it gave an example of a company in each area. So for example, IKEA working on sustainable forestry. They're a huge purchaser of wood and wood products. So they're working on biodiversity conservation, sustainable forestry. Walmart was working on sustainable fishing. I'm talking about transparency in the supply chain. So to understand where its products are coming from through the supply chain. Another one was Ørsted, which was, as it builds, say, offshore wind farms, being very aware of marine migration patterns, both birds in the air and then, fish under the ocean and such. And another one that caught my eye was Suntory, which is a big global beverage company. And they're looking at it from multiple prongs, one being water conservation, so their own operational practices, but then also investing, and we've talked about investing versus funding, investing in things like watershed replenishment projects. So kind of coming at one of their main inputs, water, at different levels, their own, what they had control over and what they could influence in the community. Anyway, so I just thought I'd raise that. It was a good paper with some good ideas from the World Economic Forum.
Thank you for that. That's an excellent resource. I'm going to turn to another question, and quite interesting. We're looking for comment on the fact that some aspects of extreme weather, such as flooding or wildfire, can have a positive impact on GDP, as we have to rebuild homes, refurbish basements in the aftermath of extreme events. How do we distinguish between good GDP and bad GDP? Who would like to take that?
Maybe I can take a first cut, Audrey.
Yes, please.
Well, I would say, after once you have those fires or those floods, from the insurance side of business, it's clear the risks are reassessed as being higher. And at a certain point, it comes to a fact that the price of insurance really gets so high that you have an affordability issue related to insurance for those specific assets. And in extreme cases, you have areas that are not assurable or insurable. And the consequence of those elements are really that the value of the asset then really gets down, because if you don't have insurance, you might not have banking, like you might not have mortgages. And hence there is a trickle-down effect on the economy that, yes, maybe in the short term, you have a GDP boost because you need reconstruction and activities. But on the long term, I think it's a losing battle if you just count off those. So obviously, it's hard to isolate those elements of good and bad GDP. But I think it should be clear to everybody on the call that it's not a winning long-term battle.
Mm-hmm. Bertrand, please go ahead.
I'm not an economist, so I won't go into the details of GDP calculation, but just a layman's comment, rebuilding something that otherwise would not have needed to be rebuilt is not a way to grow and enhance society. That money, yes, it has a GDP impact, obviously, but it could potentially have been better used to more fruitful endeavors that would actually help humanity, rather than just come back to the position that we were in before the thing was destroyed. So I'd be quite cautious about that kind of commitment, not to mention the human suffering that goes with that.
Yeah, certainly. And Joanna, I saw your hand go up there.
Yeah, I actually did want to mention the impact on people's health and well-being as well, because, I think this question just highlights the narrowness of GDP as a measure of quality of life. And I wanted to mention the opportunity cost as well that Bertrand just mentioned as well, because we shouldn't just be focusing on GDP, I think, is the answer there.
Yeah, certainly. We have time for one more question here, and we haven't talked too much about politics, but I'm going to take maybe a bit of a risk here. I think it's a good question. In the current political and financial context, what are the most important signals or measures that government can provide to help integrate nature into business actions and investments?
I can take a little bit of so I'm fairly involved in some infrastructure kind of governmental organizations as well, or providing advice. So I think one thing that the government at all different levels of government actually can do is start basically taking into account nature and costs and benefits associated with nature in their own decision making. Like I come from the UK, which you can probably hear, and for over 30 years, when we're making flood and coastal erosion risk management decisions as to what adaptation measures we're going to put in place in the UK, actually environmental habitat creation, or will actually have a financial benefit in the business case that you build around the argument. So I think factoring it into business cases at government level is important. Reporting on their own holdings is another way that governments can, 80% of land in the UK, in Canada, sorry, switch countries, 80% of Canadian lands are owned by governments, particularly the provincial governments are large landholders. So actually doing the work to kind of identify the value or the kind of extent, condition, ecosystem services and value of those natural assets, and leading by example. And also, I would say investing in natural infrastructure. There's the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, for example, has a green infrastructure stream, and I would really like to see kind of engagement with the private sector to invest in natural infrastructure projects as well under that stream, because there should be a way that we can, we recognize that the business case is there because we can avoid losses, but we need to convert those avoid losses into kind of the cash return in some kind of mechanism to convince ourselves that we can invest in natural infrastructure. So I think that's another way the government can help.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I'm afraid that's all the time we have for audience questions. In the few minutes remaining, I'd like to ask each of our speakers to very quickly, in 1 minute or less, give us one final piece of wisdom for decision makers in the financial sector. Bertrand, let's start with you.
Embrace the subject, which will be increasingly important, and start working on it, even though it's complicated and imperfect. Small steps.
Small steps. I like it. Yeah. Gildas, over to you.
I think what my takeaways around GDP and discussion is about changing the conversation of the purpose of our societies and government and businesses. Obviously, is to improve well-being, life. Yes, make money, but I think highlighting that there is more than that than just economy, and obviously that nature dependency. So changing the conversation is important. Changing what we are aiming for is part. And I mean, there are plenty of options in our interactions with executive, with our elected officials, to try to push a new way of looking at that, where nature fits into our collective ambition.
Yes, great. Lorraine, over to you. 1 minute or less.
Yes, well, there's a lot of FIs here, so I would say deploying capital to natural infrastructure is something that we really need. So that would be one point, but then maybe I will end where I started, which is that there is no net zero without nature. And so really to get the conversation going at the executive committee and boards to increase awareness, and you've heard from all of us, start and get going. And I believe that early adopters will reap the benefits.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Joanna, the last word goes to you.
I think start. I like everybody's kind of start work. We have our report coming out on the 29th, which will have steps to help people start in terms of where to look on what types of things we should be looking at as metrics. I hear the metrics and data. Metrics and data may not be perfect, but we need to start, and then we can improve, just not put off until we can be perfect, because we're not going to get to perfection on nature, but we need to do something.
Yes, and I love that you have provided a pathway for our audience with those last remarks. And so that is a great place to close. I want to thank Joanna, Lorraine, Gildas, and Bertrand for joining us today to provide their perspectives on the role and value of nature in risk management.